This is Planted, a podcast that encourages us to be rooted and grounded in Jesus Christ and established in the faith. We have a very special guest today. Dr. Jason A. Staples is joining us. Now, before we begin, I want to encourage you to be sure and check out our show notes where links to his websites are provided. Now, Dr. Staples is an author, historian, and is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University. Today, Pastor Matt and myself will be sharing a discussion surrounding his ideas in his two books. The first is titled The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, and his second book is aptly titled Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. Now grab your Bible and notepad and buckle in for one information-filled interview.
Hello again, everyone. This is Pastor Matt Grimm. I'm here once again with Thad Keenel on the Planted Podcast, and today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Jason Staples. Welcome, Jason. Glad for you to join us today.
Really happy to get a chance to talk.
Yeah. Thad and I have just thoroughly enjoyed your books. We actually all got started because, and I forget how we ran across it, another podcast, your JBL article on Romans 11, 25 and 26. And our senior pastor actually got a hold of it too. And he decided, he had a little break in his sermon series, between sermon series, and he preached a whole sermon on it based on, learning from your article. And ever since then, Thad and I have been, had to get your books and read, and we've just been, it's really been impactful for us. So thank you for all your hard work.
Well, it's wonderful to hear. I'm glad anytime I find out someone has actually read something, first of all, and then second of all, if there's ever been any sort of impact that's been fruitful in some way, that's really gratifying.
Yeah.
Like you said, you do put a lot of work into these, so really happy to hear that there's been something positive that's come out of it, at least sounds like.
I think a lot of things. You've really rounded off a lot of what we already kind of held to believe about how the gospel is working to bring all peoples to himself right now. But the key of, how he was actually doing that with the lost 10 tribes or the lost northern kingdom has really been integral to just kind of that light bulb moment that started pulling everything together. And I think since that last 6 months, the Bible comprehension seems to have grown exponentially as well with it. It's interesting that a little thing like that can really change your whole perspective of the word, and you kind of go through these growth spurts, don't you?
It is funny how there are certain things that are hidden in plain sight, and then once you see them, you kind of see them everywhere. You can, and you can't unsee them.
Right.
It's like, oh, that's I totally missed that before.
Right.
And that does happen, pretty frequently with this sort of thing. And it's a good reminder that of the importance of good foundations. I mean, so much of what we do is built on and predicated on other things that we take for granted. And if those things that we take for granted aren't accurate, or they're off just a little bit, then it's like building a wall from a foundation that's unstable, or it's not fully level. You're going to if you build a wall on a foundation that's not level, you're going to get a crooked wall.
Right.
And it's the higher you go, the more unstable the edifice is going to be. And so I think part of what I've tried to do with this work is just to sort of reevaluate and then reestablish what I think is firmer foundation for certain things in understanding a lot of biblical literature and New Testament in particular with this second book in ways that, again, I do think if we understand those things better, then there's all sorts of other things that otherwise are kind of masked or hidden, or we might get just flat out wrong, or even sometimes backwards. But as soon as we get the foundational piece put in the right place, all sorts of other stuff just kind of clicks into place, and then you can start to build well from there.
So with that being said, and some of the foundation that we've already laid, what actually got you into this mode? I mean, you're going in to write your thesis, but something had to kind of click for you as well.
Yeah, for me, this went back to actually a prophets class when I was an undergrad at Florida State, and I was taking a class on the Hebrew Bible prophets back in 2003, and the basically I went through the book of Jeremiah as my primary term paper material. That we the professor who had actually just defended his dissertation that semester as well. He ended up going on. He's now faculty at ORU, believe it or not. But he had it set up so that each student in that class, and there were I think 4 people in that class that went on to PhD programs in this field. So it was kind of a rare class. It was a strong group of students, but he set it up so that basically you got to pick one prophet early in the semester that you just really kind of make home base. And I picked Jeremiah. I was interested in Jeremiah, and then wound up spending a lot of time with Jeremiah. And over the course of the semester, there were a few things that sort of stood out. And a couple of them were related to Jeremiah, a couple of them weren't. One of the books that we used was by Gordon McConville. It's actually the IVP Exploring the Old Testament series volume on the prophets. And there are a couple places where in the discussion of the prophets, McConville made a couple comments along the lines of, well, here in Second Isaiah, it's talking about Israel, but Israel by this point has ceased to be a kingdom and a people of its own, and it's kind of hard to ascertain exactly what the prophet means by Israel here. I mean, is he referring to just the remnant from Judah? Is he, what's he doing here? So
Right.
he had a couple comments about that there, and then he had a similar comment in with Jeremiah. And as I dug deeper into Jeremiah, I noticed that there were a bunch of things that were still House of Israel and House of Judah. And Jeremiah 3 opens with prophesy to the north, because southern Judah, treacherous Judah has made faithless Israel look good by comparison.
Mm.
And then when I got to the book of consolation and to the new covenant promise, I was familiar with that. It's the longest passage quoted verbatim in the New Testament. I was quite familiar with it. But the thing that all of a sudden in that context, in the context of a class where we're really focusing on the prophets themselves in their own context rather than in a, say, New Testament context or history of tradition or whatever, all of a sudden it just suddenly I realized, like, wait a second, this promises a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah.
Right.
I don't see Gentiles here at all. And then when I see, Paul in 2 Corinthians 3 saying he's proclaiming the new covenant, but that doesn't make any sense. And like, what's Hebrews doing with it here? And Jesus, this is the new covenant in my blood. And so that sort of started the whole process. And I ended up writing a term paper that semester, basically on that problem, and arguing that the essentially the bare bones, the basic framework of what became the 2 books that were published, 18 and 20 years later, respectively. Or 18 and 21 years later.
Wow.
So that's really where that all started, and that's kind of what led me to go down this path in terms of seeking a PhD and trying to do the scholarship necessary to get to the bottom of and then demonstrate what was happening there. I just kind of assumed it'd take about a decade, and then I'd move on to whatever else was next. And it took a little longer than I anticipated. Took twice as long as things want to do. So.
Yeah.
20 years later, I finally finished the manuscript and got it in, and shortly after that, got it published. So it took a long time to get to the bottom of it,
Right.
but been working at it for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, your energy was worth it for us.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
for sure.
I can't read the Bible the same anymore, especially the prophets. It's been really cool. In the first book, you obviously do a very extremely thorough job of defining terms: Hebrew, Jew, and of course Israel. Um, and in this, somewhere along the way, you developed this deep conviction of needing to, do all this work, not just in the Bible, but Second Temple literature. And so tell us a little bit about that, even that journey, but why Second Temple literature for you is such an important aspect of this, and why you needed, gosh, you did so much research there.
Yeah. Interesting thing about that. So, when I initially started to work on this larger project for my doctoral dissertation, uh, I had proposed that I would basically make the argument on the Paul side that what Paul's doing is about Israel's restoration. Here's how he connects it to the nations, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, in that initial plan, I'd kind of presumed that I'd need an opening chapter where I would demonstrate that, okay, you've got this trajectory of uh, Israel and Israel's exile and, ultimately kind of death among the nations, uh, that then culminates in this restoration, this anticipated restoration from the nations for for in Paul's gospel, and that this is something that you see in the prophets, you see this in biblical literature, and then I thought it would be important to demonstrate uh, at least some connections beyond what we see in the Pauline corpus, because I think it's a mistake to try to treat any one of these biblical authors in isolation.
Right.
Paul is not just reading, say, the Protestant Bible, and then has a vision of Jesus and goes, "Oh, well, then I guess that's it then," and then proceeds to write. Paul
Yeah.
is himself the product of a wide variety of interpretive traditions that he has inherited from the Second Temple context and the early Jewish literature that and the traditions and the interpretations of that literature that he inherited. So then that goes into shaping and all of that, how he makes his arguments and how he comes to understand what he understands, all of that. So I thought that would be necessary to kind of show that in a chapter and move on. And what I discovered in the process of doing that work was it was going to take a lot more than a chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I got partway done. I basically got partway done with the chapter, and I was looking at something that was like 60 pages already. And then I hit a couple snags because I suddenly got to a place where there was a quote from Feldman on Josephus, where he made this offhand comment of like, well, obviously, uh, they no longer, Jews by Josephus period no longer thought of themselves as an exile, but rather took diaspora as a positive kind of phenomenon. And I saw this as I was working through some of this material, and it struck me as so odd. It's like, really?
Hmm.
Where is he getting this? And so at that point, I started, as I do, I started pulling out on the thread. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, where did he get that? Where is he getting this assumption? And so pulled out on it, and it's like, oh, such and such over here said this too. And then, oh, he says that. Where is this coming from? And as I then pulled that thread out, I realized that not only could I not make this case strongly in one chapter, but because it was not a Pauline studies problem, that Pauline scholars had not seen this, which was sort of what I was working from. It was like, okay, well, I need to explain this for people who are reading Paul. I suddenly realized this is a field-wide problem, not only in Pauline studies, but in larger biblical scholarship and even in early Jewish scholarship. And this is going to require a much more extensive discussion, because when you have and prior to my writing Idea of Israel, the general sort of consensus that had developed, and there had been some challenges to it, but it still was sort of a consensus, was this position of sort of Jews by the first century at least, and really before that, had ceased to, regard themselves in exile, but rather took a more optimistic view of diaspora and this distinction
Right.
between diaspora theology and exilic theology. And it occurred to me that if that foundation remained in place, if people continued to hold to that view in early Judaism, then they would not be able to see or understand so much of what was going on, not just in Paul, but in all sorts of other things that I'd run across along the way. And it's like, okay, now I need to address that problem. And that also came with the inside outside perspective of, Israel and of the Israelite and, Jew terminology that I ended up having to address. As I discovered those sort of foundations of this other stuff, I realized I needed to do something that really focused on addressing that,
Mm-hmm.
and then I could get to the Paul stuff later. And
Right.
and that's really where I ended up spending most of my time for, good, what, 12 years or so, is building up that so that we could better understand. Again, it's about foundations. So if we're reading Paul foundationally, we need to better establish what his foundations would be. And so I had to relay some of that foundation and address some of those other things first. And it ended up being a project on its own that stands, I think stands or falls regardless of what happens on the Paul side. But then it also that helps us understand what's going on, not just in Paul, but in the New Testament. And I think also even in rabbinic literature and other stuff that comes later, you still see this trajectory working through a lot of that material.
Right.
Can I ask you a clarifying question in regard to the diaspora? Is that primarily or only in reference to after the Babylonian captivity with Judah, or does it also include what took place with the
Northern
the
tribes.
northern tribes?
So that's a good question. The general, so a couple things. First, we should back up for the listeners, and I'll explain a little bit of what the general thesis is of that first book,
Right.
which then sort of sets the foundation for the second book, the Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. So in the idea of Israel, what I aim to demonstrate is that uh, there remains throughout the Second Temple period, so and the period after the ostensible return from Babylon, essentially, the period, let's say, starting loosely with the Babylonian exile, and ending with the destruction of the Second Temple in the first century CE.
Right.
My argument is that essentially there remains throughout that period an expectation of a much larger restoration of all 12 tribes of Israel that dramatically supersedes and uh, exceeds the very small sort of paltry return from Babylon that you see in the Persian period that that is recounted in Ezra and Nehemiah and results in the building of the Second Temple and all of that. That throughout the Second Temple period, while that Second Temple is standing, you get with remarkable consistency, Jewish sources continually exhibit an expectation, a sort of understanding that, well, this second temple, yeah, it's fine and all, but that's not like the thing that God promised after the exile. That at some point there's going to be something future that's going to happen. It's often associated with some sort of Messiah figure, but there's going to be a bigger and better temple situation. The people of God are going to be restored, all 12 tribes, which has not happened yet, and it's going to be much larger. People are God's people are going to be made into obedient people, which, look around, not everybody's obeying the way that they should. There's lots of those people over there. It's rarely us. It's those people over there who are, Jews or Samaritans or whomever. They're not keeping Torah correctly, but when all this stuff gets made right, they will. So there's this expectation that develops throughout that period that just holds, and it's due to a sort of straightforward reading of the Torah, especially the end chapters of Leviticus. So Leviticus 25 and 26 in
Yes.
particular,
Yes.
the end of Deuteronomy,
Right.
the book of Daniel, and then the prophets. So there's this expectation that well, God has punished his people for their infidelity. And at some point in the future, God is going to see to it that he makes them into a faithful people and then restores them in this way. So that remains, my argument is that that remains a central part of early Jewish expectation throughout the Second Temple period and really beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And the this butts up against the problem, and there's this sort of presumption that had developed in the second half of the 20th century, is really the 70s through the early parts of the 21st century, that you started to see this movement begin, where there was this kind of there was this tendency to read uh, the sorry, my logic just had a problem. But there's this tendency to read this early Jewish material almost as though these Second Temple Jews living in the diaspora were sort of proto-Reform Jews.
Okay.
And I'll develop that in just a moment. But what I mean by then the diaspora and where this gets developed is basically it's this presumption that once the Persian period begins and Cyrus' decree goes out and Jews are essentially permitted and encouraged to return to the land, those Jews that remained wherever they were living did so presumably voluntarily. Now, this neglects the fact that not all Jews were free. There were some that had been enslaved during that period. There's all sorts of other factors that this neglects as well. But there's generally this recognition that, like, look, there are a lot of these people who remain in exile voluntarily. They remain wherever they had been scattered, and they decide, yeah, you know what? I'm better off here than I would be returning. And so the expectation or the explanation of that by a lot of scholars of early Judaism was, well, what happened is once they'd been in exile for long enough, and then that decree happened, essentially they dropped this kind of exilic notion of, well, we are in exile here awaiting restoration. And instead, they embraced where they were and they lived prosperously wherever they were. And they said, no, Athens is now my home, and I'm perfectly happy to be here and be Jewish. And this is where I'm planted, and I'm going to stay here. And so you have this notion of trading this pessimistic exilic theology in which there's an expectation of some future rescue from the current negative state versus the positive, optimistic, Hellenistic optimism is often what it's called, but this diaspora theology in which, you know what? No, God has sown us among all the nations as a scattered people, and that's a good thing. And this is sort of how this was understood by a lot of scholarship, sort of in the second half of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century. And again, I think that more or less, I don't think it's a coincidence that the scholars who generally pushed into that particular argument were by and large Reform Jews, for whom that attitude is exactly the attitude of Reform Judaism. Right. I mean, if you look at what developed, and many of your audience may not be familiar with the difference between Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism or Conservative Judaism, but the Reform movement developed in 18th, 19th century Germany, and then also in the United States and a few other places. But it developed out of essentially the sort of post-Enlightenment and emancipation of Jews within Western Europe in particular, where prior to the 18th century, you had by and large Rabbinic Judaism holding to a fairly traditional practices, distinguishing themselves from their surroundings, dressing differently, eating differently, just generally standing out as very different from their surroundings, and continuing to wait, as the Amidah, the traditional prayers said in the synagogue and all this, continuing to wait for God's deliverance. And finally, you get to the Reform movement and they say, yeah, see, here's the thing. Actually, if we just dress a little differently, maybe loosen up a little bit on some of the dietary stuff and all of this, and embrace where we're living, we can participate in the messianic renewal that is happening. And We don't have to wait for this external thing that's probably never going to happen. We can participate in this renewal of the world ourselves here and now. And in fact, I can be German and Jewish. I'm a German Jew, and my homeland is Berlin. Or I'm a German Jew, and my homeland, or I'm an American Jew, and my homeland is Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. Any number of those things. So essentially, that becomes the sort of way of thinking about it. Of I'm here, I'm embracing my diaspora existence, but that doesn't make me any less Jewish, and that's pretty typical, traditional Reform perspective.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And that's read into, I think, the diaspora situation by a lot of scholars in the second half of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to jump in just with a follow-up question. Do you, what's your understanding of the Shekinah's return for the Second Temple period, or do you think that we don't see a return of the Lord until the bridegroom is released from his chambers and enters in with Christ?
So I don't think there's any evidence in the Second Temple period of any restoration of the Shekinah or the Chavod, the glory, to the temple. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one of those things. If you read the book of Ezra, they dedicate the temple, and when you compare that to, say, the dedication of the temple with Solomon, there are a few things that stick out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Number one is Solomon's dedication doesn't include any sin offerings. It includes a whole lot of fellowship offerings or shalamim, a lot of peace offerings, as they're often called. Lots of celebratory offerings there. In Ezra, you have the elders of the Jews offer 12 bulls as a sin offering for all 12 tribes of Israel. So that's one thing that stands out. The other thing that stands out is in the dedication of Solomon, in Kings and in Chronicles, the glory of the Lord descends on the house in such power that the priests ultimately can't stand to continue to do their service. And there's this whole, like, the glory shows up and it's noticeable, it's manifest.
Right.
And that doesn't happen in Ezra. Right? There's none of that. And then when you get to Second Maccabees and some of these other things, you get the whole story about, well, they recover the sacred fire, but the actual, like, the ark and the whole, like, return of the glory and all that hasn't really happened. And this is a pretty consistent thing that we see throughout that literature, is that the glory doesn't actually return in the way that it had been in the first temple, at least, in the stories of the first temple. So that ends up being, again, a part of the whole issue that you see as a continually unsolved problem within Second Temple Jewish literature.
Yeah.
Is, the glory has to return. And part of the argument of the Gospels in the New Testament is that the glory does actually return in the person of Jesus.
Yes.
And is not actually adequately recognized, and is in fact resisted.
Right.
And so that's a big part of the early Christian message is, no, the glory had not returned, but it did.
Yeah. And don't you think that in some sense, the lack of that pessimism in some scholarship, and I would say even like in a lot of American Christianity at times, that there's not enough pessimism when it comes to, like, Ezra, Nehemiah, and not paying enough attention to the end of Deuteronomy and not seeing what Jesus is claiming in that sense?
Yeah, I'm continually amazed by the number of Christian readers who read, say, Nehemiah, and they're like, what a hero.
Right.
Oh, we need to be wall builders. And you have these organizations that are, called wall builders and all of this. And it's like, guys, Nehemiah is not a success.
Right.
Right? This is not like Nehemiah mentions that the prophets are opposing him, first of all. Second of all, he knows full well that Zechariah has prophesied that the new city, the new Jerusalem, will be a city without walls. And yet Nehemiah comes in and his task is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Well, wait, what? And then he campaigns and crusades for people to divorce. Right. And that these are good things?
Yeah.
How exactly are we getting there? And then you get to, someone like Malachi, who is prophesying in that Second Temple period, perhaps around the time of Nehemiah, and he's prophesying against those who are divorcing their wives. And you wonder, like, is this actually is Malachi actually disagreeing with what Nehemiah is doing?
Correct. Yeah.
And the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah portrays the protagonists in very sort of ambiguous fashion. They're not outright heroes. There's things that, if you read the book carefully, there's things that you look at and you should see as praiseworthy, and there's a whole lot that you go, oh, now this is
Right.
this is evidence that things are not as they should be.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I got a little bit of an interesting proposition here for you to think about. I'm curious if you think you could do this. If you're invited to preach at a church on a Sunday morning, maybe you got 45 minutes or so, right? And they want you to address kind of the key ideas of your two books, but you need to ground it in a passage from the Gospels. Okay, maybe a parable. Do you think, is there a parable or something from the Gospels you say, yeah, I could be faithful to telling that the message of the parable in the Gospels, and I at the same time can talk about the message of my two books.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I could probably do it from almost any of the parables, because all of them are sort of working in that kind of direction. Probably
Right,
the easiest
yeah.
one would be the prodigal son story.
Yes, that's what I thought of. That's exactly what I thought.
Because you have the two sons, and
Yeah.
one of them goes out and essentially gentilizes as
Yes.
a result of apostasy, and then is brought back in a fashion that is unacceptable to the older brother, and yet the older brother still inherits everything and has to open his heart and protection for his younger brother. So
Right.
there's a lot going there, but you could do it with the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you'd have to explain what the
Right,
origin of
the
the Samaritans
Samaritan, yeah.
is and how that works. You could do it with the parable of the sower, which is the one parable that appears in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You could do it with the woman and the leaven. There's a number of these things. The lost sheep. There's a variety of parables, or the bridesmaids. The wise and foolish bridesmaids. There's any number of them that you can ground this sort of thing in. But ultimately, you're going to end up having to come back to the work of God to bring about the faithfulness of his people, to repair the fundamental heart problems that are evident throughout, from the Torah forward.
Right.
And that ultimately is where this moves, and that this is done in such a way as to redeem and restore even those who seem to be permanently lost, and that this is a resurrection phenomenon, brings us back to the basic stuff. It preaches.
Yeah, it definitely does. After reading, I think it was your article, and I just happened to be reading the prodigal, the son the next day, and I'm like, oh, it's right here. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, I did a conference presentation on that back in probably 2009, that I need to put out as a academic article at some point. But it's one of those things about being trivocational, is that you just don't have the time to get everything written that you'd like. So maybe at some point when that conference paper is 15 or 20 years old, I'll actually get it in print.
Yeah. One thing that really stood out to me in your second book, as I was reading, because it relates a lot to things that Thad and I talk about on our podcast, because we talk about how just the whole Bible's eschatological. It's all moving, forward. And it was actually in a footnote from, you were talking about how you chose to use the terminology restoration eschatology from E.P. Sanders. And you mentioned that the eschatology in this context, in the footnote, you say not necessarily imply the end of the world, but rather the end of the present age and the dawn of the new one. And that's something that we've talked about a lot. Our pastor's been preaching about that a lot. And so just, can you talk a little bit about, in terms of your own, even your own faith and the way that you, that's impacted you, of that, just the mentality of this kind of inaugurated eschatology that is happening here, and God's faithfulness to his promises, that it's, this isn't supersessionism. This isn't, it's really fulfillment. God's keeping his word, but he's also, opened up the dawn of this new age. And so how's that impacted your life and just, your faith?
I think one thing that it does is it to some degree eliminates this sort of escapism that often characterizes Western forms of Christianity in particular. But you look at sort of the Hal Lindsey style,
right? The dispensational,
dispensational approach that has characterized a lot of American evangelicalism for a
Right.
very long time. It sort of inoculates a person against that to some degree, to where it's not all about like, okay, I just got to set myself up and, what this is about is I need to, ask Jesus into my heart so that he could come back any day. And when he comes back, I'm going to be taken to the by and by and rescued from this world. And, I'll be able to live in paradise, forever at some other time. It's not about that. This notion of one age giving to another, the end of an age proceeding into a new age. And then especially if, as I see Paul arguing, this new age has been inaugurated by the resurrection of Jesus, such that those who are in Christ are actually living in and participating in that new age, even if vestiges or, more than vestiges of the old age persist alongside it. So essentially you have kind of two ages going alongside one another,
Right.
Until the full return of Jesus. The living in that age, in that new age, ultimately becomes all about learning to obey, to walk by the Spirit, and to be an agent of justice in the world.
Mm.
And so I think my take on that is that understanding, or recognizing that difference, that this is about the end of an age of wrath and the beginning of this age of grace, of equipment to do God's will, becomes an invitation to be an agent of justice, of God's justice in the world. And it puts a responsibility on those who do receive that message and who do, receive that Spirit, that there's an expectation. There's to the one to whom much is given, much is expected. There's an expectation of living with justice and bringing light and life to those around you now, rather than like, hey, let me tell you about Jesus so that you can, get your ticket so that'll be good for later. No. Right. The gospel in the New Testament is a gospel for the present, not just for the future, because the future has broken into the present in a way that is irreparably impactful. And if that's not the way that's actually coming out in practice, then there's an open question of whether or not a person has actually embraced and welcomed and received the gospel itself, the good news itself.
Right.
Because the gospel that I see is about more than this, hey, do you know where you're going when you die kind of question.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And what's so cool to me is, because, Thad and I have been coming from that approach for years, but it's how in that, especially when we jump ahead to the Romans 11, 25 and 26, and that the preaching to the Gentiles and all that's happening related to that is no way abandoning Israel. And it's actually reaching the lost tribes, right? And so when that notion, how did you, because you connect this back to Genesis 48 and the crossing of the hands of Jacob with Ephraim and Manasseh, and when this all started to crystallize in you as it related to the new covenant and so forth, were you just like jumping out of your seat? I mean, what I know you said you like to just pull on a little string at a time, but at some point you had to have this, like, it was almost like an apocalypse for you, right?
Yeah, it happened pretty early.
Mm.
And there's been a number of times where you just sort of where I've found myself just sort of sitting and going, oh, and recognizing like, oh, that's so much more elegant than I'd realized. And actually the Genesis 48 thing, that was the result. I was dating a young woman at the time. This was 2006, and we used to uh, she was fairly uh, she was not especially biblically literate. Uh, was a fairly new Christian at the time, and one of the things that we were doing while we were dating is that at night before bed we would call one another on the phone and we were reading through scripture,
Mm.
and then she could ask questions or whatever, but we would read through just so that became a practice.
Okay.
And familiarity was gained, and it happened in 2006 that I was reading through with her on the phone. I was reading through Genesis 48 and came to verse 19 and read it, and then recognized, like, wait a second, that's Moloha Goyim. That's like, I've read this before every time as just, you just kind of skim over this. His descendants will be, a multitude of nations, as it's often glossed in,
Mm-hmm.
NASB or NIV or whatever. But all of a sudden I realized, like, no. The Hebrew here is Moloha Goyim. Oh, so as I was reading through on the phone, all of a sudden I hit that verse. I recognized what it actually said in Hebrew, and went and just stopped for a second and just went, oh. But as I'm stopped, I'm hearing, hello. Are you there? Like, yes, just give me a second. Like, oh. And it was, and I was at the time working on, developing some of this for a conference presentation, and that went right, straight into that new paper at that point,
Mm.
and that
Mm.
became a foundational piece of what came later. Uh, but yeah, that's just one case in point where it was like, as I'm reading through, there's just this sudden realization, and then sort of breath leaves you, and you go, oh,
Yeah.
that's been there the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
How did oh, wow.
Yeah.
And then that opens up so many other things. And then when you start to develop that and you start to see
Yeah.
Ephraim here, and then, okay, now we're seeing pieces being put together in ways that, until you recognize that that piece has that color, you can't even put it into the right spot in that shape. You can't even put it into a specific spot on the um on the puzzle. But that was like getting one of the corner pieces.
Mm-hmm.
If you I don't know if you
Right.
do puzzles, but it was like getting one of the corner
Yeah.
pieces where it's like, oh, that's a corner piece that I'll be able to, like, I can start to build from that.
Yeah.
And there were a few of those. The new covenant promise was probably the first corner piece.
Mm-hmm.
Along that combination of the new covenant promise and Jeremiah 3 were sort of the first corner piece. Genesis 48:19 was sort of the second corner piece. Uh, and then, there were a few others this was a multi-cornered puzzle.
Right.
But there were, a few others that kind of clicked into place at different points where it was like, oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, it was also like, oh, maybe that's why Joseph gets so much time at the end of Genesis. Right.
Yeah. All of a sudden you realize, like, wait a second, it turns out Joseph is really important.
Yeah.
And it should have been evident by the fact that he gets 13 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
Judah only gets one.
Yeah.
And then he is a bit player in Joseph's story. So, this is important. By the way, another one of those puzzle pieces was realizing the connection between Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 10, and then 11 through 14, and realizing that those are connected in such a way that 11 through 14 presume what's happening in 1 through 10, that this is not resuming a prior discourse, but they're dependent on, that they're referring to the time after 1 through 10 happens. And there was another corner piece where it was like, oh, that makes so much more sense of so many other things. It's just little things like that,
Right.
that all of a sudden, it just takes a little bit of time, and then the nut cracks and you realize, like, oh, that fits so much better here, and you can start to build around it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if you have a question. I'm
I
keeping all the
have
questions
7
for you.
pages of questions.
So, but just one other little thing, because it's just so big. When as I was digesting some of this stuff too, and it was before I actually read it in one of your books, but or the second book, I said, you know what, I'm gonna get up my, I think it was the ESV exhaustive concordance, and look at the book of Romans and see where Israel appears, and it's only in chapters 9 to 11, and it just, I fell out of my chair. And so, in terms of that whole argument of there, Paul's bringing, it's Jews, 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 and then the switch. So, what, in just, as briefly as you can, that argument in Romans, what's the crux of Paul's switch there in chapter 9 to having to talk about Israel?
What he's doing through Romans 1 through 11 is he's explaining how he's making this specific argument to explain how the promises to the people of God, to Israel, are in fact being fulfilled through the gospel that he's proclaiming. So through the death and resurrection of Jesus, through the reception of the Spirit. But the problem is he has to explain a couple things. Number one is, why exactly is this happening with people who are uncircumcised men who are not Jews?
Yeah.
This is a promise that is made to Israel and to Judah, not them. So he has to explain that. And so he sets out early on to try to address that in chapters 1 through 8, to demonstrate that the Spirit that is being poured out, that is producing the obedience to God that it's producing, that this is exactly what God promised in the prophets, and that this was the only solution to a fundamental problem, a heart problem that had characterized Israel, and not just Israel, but all the nations prior to that, and that Israel received promises that this would change for them. But now suddenly the nations also are participating as well. And that leads to this final problem. And what he does throughout those first 8 chapters is, this is to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Not only Jews, right, but also Gentiles. Why? Well, that's when we get to Romans 9 to 11, he's gotten past Romans 8, and Romans 8 is this, highlight chapter where he explains that what the Torah could not do, and that it was weak from the flesh, or weak through the flesh, God did by sending his Son. And so then those who receive the Spirit of God, as many as receive the Spirit of God, these are the children of God, and they're the ones who call Abba Father. And that if God is for us, who can be against all of this, right? But the problem still remains at the end of chapter 8. Okay, so God is fulfilling his promises. These are great promises of God, and we're okay, fine, we can grant that. This seems to be the what God has promised in Deuteronomy and in the prophets, that I will write my law in your heart, and my laws on your heart, and you will obey me. I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. I will sprinkle clean water on you and be clean. All of these things. I will circumcise your heart. All of these things from Deuteronomy, from right, Jeremiah, from Ezekiel, etc. But you still have the problem. But wait a second. Why is this happening with the nations? And wasn't this supposed to be accompanying the restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel? Or is God faithful to pour out his Spirit, but he's actually abandoned his people? Has God abandoned his people? Is this God really unfaithful, such that we can't trust that this is actually going to work? It sounds good now, but if God's not faithful to his people, this was promised to the 12 tribes. So why isn't this accompanied by the restoration of Israel that it should be?
Right.
That's why he switches from Jews and Gentiles who are visible around at that moment. There's Jews, there's Gentiles, each of whom, some of them are receiving the Spirit, some of whom are not. But both Jews and Gentiles are receiving the Spirit. But the real problem is this was promised as a part of the restoration of all 12 tribes of Israel. And so now he has to explain, yeah, about that. And Romans 9 to 11 goes through essentially it takes you through a historical explanation of here's what happened from the patriarchs through the exile of Israel, the exiles of Israel and Judah. Here's what God promised, and in fact, God has not been unfaithful to his promise, but rather he promised, he promised to northern Israel. He said, "You are not my people, and I am not your God, and I'm going to scatter you among the nations." But then he promised, "I will say to those who are not my people, my people."
Yeah.
Well, but that's happening to the nations right now. They are not my people, and they're being brought in. So there's your first hint at the end of chapter 9. Then he gets in and explains a little bit more in chapter 10. And then by the time we get to the end of chapter 11, he's sort of put all his cards on the table, and he's saying, look, Israel assimilated among the nations, the bulk of Israel assimilated among the nations, but God's faithfulness to his people Israel extends even beyond that, so that he will bring in people from the nations in order to ensure that he brings in his people from Israel who have assimilated among the nations. And so now the whole thing, the purpose of Israel being selected to be a light to the nations, to be a nation of priests, all of this is fulfilled in Israel's restoration through the ingathering of people from the nations where Israel was scattered. And so the whole thing then becomes sort of an all in all situation. And at that point, he then says, God's plan was a little bit deeper and a little bit more elegant than what we anticipated. That's when he breaks off in praise at the end of chapter 11.
So good, such good stuff. Yeah.
There's a lot of questions, but I'm trying to just find one that's probably the most helpful. As we are in a Reformed covenantal church community, there's still a lot of dispensational mindset out there, of course. And what do you think might be the key to help people understand that, Jesus says the gospel is going to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the outer reaches of the earth, and that the entire church is okay with Jews coming to Christ now, but why are they waiting for a mass influx at the end of the age of the Gentiles? Is there a key passage that helps, or do you have to just coax people along and let them come to it, on their own?
It depends. I think every person is in a different place when it comes to this sort of thing. And
let me rephrase the question for 1 second, because what's cool is my son wasn't raised dispensationally, because I had already gotten out of dispensationalism to understand this a little bit better. And so it's so easy for him because he didn't have to get out of the rut of his presuppositions. And that's really the big hurdle. I mean, I had to wrestle through that.
yeah, so it's completely different. It depends on where people are. And there are some people where a more a more detailed approach and working through this sort of material one time might do it. There are other folks for whom it's only going to happen through revelation, and there's a certain amount of exposing folks to those sorts of things, to materials that can give them opportunity to see a little bit, but you can't force it. You have to be, I think gentleness is really important in this kind of thing. But I think the main thing to come back to that I do think is a consistent thing for helping people better understand, and this is true for being disabused of any sort of false view. I think one important thing that holds to all of that is to ask questions and to help the people that you are working with ask questions, and to make sure that they're asking better questions, and then have them go and search out and seek for good answers. What I find is that when we give people answers, if they're not ready for those answers, it's not going to make a single bit of difference, because it's sort of one of my favorite movies is Inception. And one of the things that Christopher Nolan does so well in that movie is illustrate this this principle that if an idea from outside of someone's own framework is presented to them, their subconscious will resist it like white blood cells. Right?
Yeah.
You present a truth, and it's the truth. Somebody has a false view, and you present the truth to them that confronts their deeply held beliefs in some way, and there's just something deep inside us that resists it and wants to hold to whatever is familiar. Instead, in order to succeed in that movie, what do you have to do? You have to get deep inside, and you have to have something emerge from someone's own mind as their own idea. We only really get something when we take ownership of it. We only really come to know something when that knowledge is something that we've taken ownership of. And so, good teaching very much depends on, first of all, helping people ask good questions. And so asking good questions and saying, okay, let's go to the scripture, and let's for a dispensationalist, one of the primary foundations of dispensationalism, there's generally four foundations of dispensationalism, but maybe the most important of them is this idea that Israel and the church are separate entities,
Right.
because Israel is to be identified with the Jews, period. Well, one of the first places to start with that is to ask the question, okay, where is the tribe of Reuben now? How should we understand what happened to Reuben or to Naphtali or to Asher? And can we go to the Bible? Can we go to, Jewish tradition to answer this question? How do we understand what happened to that? And by the way, why, if we're talking about Israel, why should we assume that the word Jew is just exactly the same thing, that it's synonymous with Israel? Maybe we should look at the Bible and how it uses those terms. Let's ask those questions. And if someone then seeks answers to those questions, you can put some materials in their hand to help them seek that out faster. But getting them to ask that question is the first step. And then, beyond that, I do think, as a rule, Christians would be well off to recognize that stories do a lot better job of teaching than, and I'm a hypocrite to some degree here, but I think you have to have both. But if you want teaching to be lasting, and if you want it to be something that disseminates persuasively and impacts people dramatically, it needs to be in story form. We need to write good stories. We need to have people reading good stories. There's no amount of my explaining to someone that love your neighbor as yourself should apply to whoever is close to whoever comes across your path. I can make that case and illustrate, and try to emphasize that we should all love our neighbor, and our neighbor is the person who is nearby that I can actually help. Okay, great. That's a wonderful principle. Is that going to be more or less impactful than telling the story of the Good Samaritan? The Good Samaritan gets that across in a way that is unforgettable, and it taps into something that is deep within us to say, okay, we need to be like that.
Right.
That taps into an emotional, it's the mythological quality to it. And myth in the sense of, a story with deep truth embedded in it.
Exactly.
We need to be, as people who are, trying to help other people understand these things better, we need to get better at myth.
Yep. That's right.
That's fantastic. This is something that maybe is a topic. Well, I'm not sure if it's a topic. Let me just ask the question. Can you explain your idea of no true Scotsman as it refers to
Okay, so the no true Scotsman fallacy is it's a widely cited logical fallacy where you have an idea that Scotsmen don't speak French, as an example, or Scotsmen don't commit X crime, and then you point at someone and you say, well, he's from Scotland and he committed he committed that crime, or he speaks French. And then the rebuttal is, well, no true Scotsman does this. Like, he's not really a Scotsman if he does this. That's the sort of logical fallacy of it, right? On the flip side, though, and this is often used, in sort of scholarship coming from the outside in as a way to say, well, you have, let's say, in the modern world, you might have Christians say, well, part of being a Christian is loving one's neighbor. And then somebody says, yeah, well, what about that Christian who just bombed the abortion clinic down there? Right? And you go, well, like, if he's bombing an abortion clinic, he's not really a Christian, despite the fact that that person did so with a manifesto that is all about his Christianity, et cetera,
Sure.
right? And so this is then seen as a logical fallacy. Like, no, look, you're using this fallacy as a way to, to try to insulate yourself from criticism. Now, what I pointed out in the second book in Paul and the Resurrection of Israel is that for insiders, the no true Scotsman argument actually does have a functional value that goes past its not a fallacy exactly when applied from the inside. So if I am, say, a church leader and I say, Christians do not commit adultery, that is not something that Christians do. That is a normative statement that serves as a way to draw the boundaries of what is and what is not acceptable behavior for people who are part of my group, who are part of those who claim to be Christians. And if then someone does commit adultery who is part of that, then the group has certain options, and the group can say, you know what, if you're going to live like this and you're going to continue to behave like this, you can't be a part of our group. In that case, what you have is essentially a no true Scotsman kind of idea, but it's actually enforced, and it's actually part of self-definition of any group. And every group actually depends on this kind of move. Every group depends on drawing boundaries of who is in and who is out, who is part of us and who's not. No girls allowed, right? Sign on a clubhouse. And then, a girl comes up there and, well, that's a contradiction. Well, yeah, but when the boys in that clubhouse, actively resist the presence of, like, no, you can't come in, you're no girls allowed. Well, they're enforcing the boundary. So we have to be able to distinguish between the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is a sort of illegitimate argument from the outside, trying to evaluate and analyze from the outside on the basis of insider claims, and the function, the rhetorical and didactic function of that no true Scotsman declaration for a group that's actually defining its own boundaries. So the United States could say, the United States could, for example, pass a law that said, if anybody commits X, Y, and Z crime, I don't know, pedophilia, something like that, then that person loses his American citizenship. So, because no American does this.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a no true Scotsman fallacy at that point. That's just no Americans do this. Because if you do this and you get caught, then you are no longer going to be an American. You're going to be expelled from the country in some way, and you're going to lose your citizenship, etc. That's the basic difference.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's one of the things that we've been focusing on in our teaching quite a bit. And I'm in a series right now covering some of the book of Revelation when it speaks of the 144,000. And I keep utilizing this term true Israel, or is the same as true Christian. And, you come at this 7 different ways to narrow the gap of what Paul says, that not all Israel is of Israel, or in that vein. And so I've even been using this term eschatological Israel as a form of that true Israel that goes throughout all of time that God has brought forth. And I kind of made that term up. I don't even know if that makes sense. Is that a good term to use?
What,
Or
eschatological Israel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I used that term more than once in Paul and the Resurrection of Israel.
Oh, then that's where I got it from. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a legitimate term, because again, the idea that you've got going in Paul, and this is an idea that's already present in other early Jewish groups as well, is that there is this expectation, and Paul thinks it's already happening in his communities, of a restored Israelite assembly. Like, so you go back to the Torah and you have the assembly of Israel, which is, the 12 tribes, the representation of the 12 tribes before God, that is gathered together and is renewed spiritually and restored in a way that puts Israel together, that finally puts Israel back together at the dawn of this new age. And Paul thinks this is happening. So for him, this is absolutely an eschatological or end times or new era, new age Israel, that is something different from the Israel in the wilderness. And it's different from the more limited group of Jews in the Second Temple period, or Samaritans in the Second Temple period, each of whom is justifiably called Israelite. These are Israelite individuals, but Israel as a people, as a body of people, does not exist in the first century. There is no ethnos, or people, or nation of Israel in the first century. There's the nation of there is the nation that is represented in the province of Judea, which is just Judah. You have the people who go back to the Joseph tribes and the Samaritans, but you don't have this greater Israel. You don't have this nation of Israel. And that's precisely what they think is being restored and renewed by these people who are coming in and receiving the Spirit. So for them, this renewed people is this end times renewed Israel that is, in a way, a return to what was prior to the exile, but it's the way that Israel should have been, right? It's, for those of you familiar with Tolkien, it's Israel as, are you Saruman? Well, I'm Saruman as he should have been, right? This is Israel as he should have been, as it should have been, because God has made Israel into this new, renewed thing.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, I want to respect your time. I know you need to go soon. So, are we at the time limit?
We pretty much are. Yeah, we definitely want to respect his time. He's got to go and stuff. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
Well, I mean, I'd be happy to chat with you guys again. I'm encouraged to hear about what you guys are doing up there. Yeah, I'm really grateful for the chance to get to talk with you, and looking forward to hopefully some continued fruit over the next the foreseeable future. So thanks so much for this.
Yeah, we appreciate it so much, and Lord bless your work, and we pray that you continue to. I'm looking forward to that prodigal son paper someday. I can't wait for it. So
that's great. Yeah, we're also kindred spirits in another sense. I walked on, played Division II football at Michigan Tech, and you were a walk on down there, and I played 4 years. You didn't play all 4 years though, did you?
Nope. My body broke down a little before that, and it was more obvious, I think, that my NFL future was not going to happen.
Yeah.
Are you still associated at all with the program?
With Florida State?
Yeah.
So a little bit. I mean, I still do some sports coverage there, and I still am in contact with some of the coaches and people in the athletic department there, but less directly connected than I used to be.
Yeah, that's great. Well, listen, we really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll definitely set it up. We need a part 2 on this.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care, Jason.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye.
Be sure to take a look at our show notes or simply visit jasonstaples.com and then consider to support Jason and also your biblical growth with the purchase of one or both of his books. Planet is a Cornerstone EPC production, connecting to God, one another, and the world through the love of Jesus. More information can be found at cornerstonebrighton.com.